If you ever found yourself on a 19th century cattle drive, there's one man you'd never want to cross. And no, it wasn't the gunslinging cowboy or the trail boss with a jaw like stone. It was the cook. Yeah, that grumpy, grease-splattered fella running the Chuckwagon, king of beans, biscuits, and bad attitudes. The man who could make or break your day with one scoop of burnt stew. Out there, in the endless dust and sun, cowboys feared the cook more than stampedes, snakes, or the wrath of their boss. Because that man controlled the one thing more powerful than bullets: breakfast. He was part chef, part medic, part psychologist, and part warden. Without him, no herd would reach the rail yards. Without him, the West would have starved. So how does pot-banging tyrant earn such terror and respect? Why get hardened cowboys? Men who'd fight a grizzly, turning the polite schoolboys around a man in a dirty apron? Today, we're pulling back the wagon flap on one of the most misunderstood legends of the frontier. The Chuckwagon cook. The unholy mix of saint, sinner, and drill sergeant who kept the Wild West alive one biscuit at a time. Folk! Hitch up your wagon and stick with Old America Explained. We're uncovering the everyday lives, habits, and stories of old America you never knew. Picture this. It's the late 1800s, somewhere between Texas and Kansas. You're a cowboy, saddle sore, sun cooked, and half mad from the wind. You've been riding for weeks, herding thousands of cattle across open plains that look like God's unfinished backyard. The only thing that gets you up before dawn ain't the sunrise. It's the clang of an iron triangle. That sound? That's the cook calling breakfast. And if you don't hustle, he'll make sure you regret it. Because that man ain't just a fry cook. He's the engine of the whole drive. He plans routes with the trail boss, manages supplies, patches busted wagons, brews tar black coffee, and somehow keeps 12 cranky men from killing each other. He's cook, doctor, accountant, and referee, all rolled into one scowling human being fueled by caffeine and spite. And make no mistake, his word is law. You don't touch his gear, you don't sass his stew, and you sure as hell don't show up late to eat. In the brutal democracy of the trail, the cook was the only dictator everyone agreed to obey. Chuckwagon cooks weren't feared because they were cruel. They were feared because without them, everything fell apart. A cattle drive wasn't some weekend camping trip. It was months of dust, storms, and exhaustion. If the cook got sick or ran out of supplies, the whole operation was toast. No food meant no men. No men meant no cattle. No cattle meant bankruptcy. So, cooks ruled their wagons like drill sergeants with ladles. Touch his sourdough starter? You might as well dig your own grave. Complain about his beans? You'll be chewing air while everyone else eats. Even the trail boss wouldn't pick that fight. 'Cause when the coffee pot ran dry, nobody rode happy. These men weren't just feeding bellies. They were feeding morale. And when morale went south, fights broke out, horses got spooked, and someone ended up in the dirt. So yeah, maybe the cook scared the hell out of everyone. But fear was his seasoning. It kept order, and order kept folks alive. Let's step inside that dusty wooden wagon. Part kitchen, part madhouse. Every morning, long before the first rooster even considered crowing, the cook was already up. He'd be rolling biscuit dough with one hand, stirring beans with the other, and yelling at some poor cowboy to bring more firewood. By the time the sun peeked over the plains, breakfast was served dark coffee strong enough to peel paint, and biscuits hard enough to double as ammo. Then he'd clean up, pack everything, and haul the wagon ahead of the herd to set up lunch. That's right, he wasn't riding with the crew. He was racing miles ahead, battling the terrain, praying his mules didn't break a wheel or his beans didn't burn. There were no recipes, just gut instinct and iron pans blackened by years of campfire soot. It was cooking at the edge of civilization, a game of heat, wind, and luck. And through it all, he kept that gruff authority. Because out there, one mistake could turn a trail drive into a disaster. The cook's temper wasn't just personality, it was protection. Every cowboy knew the sacred laws of the Chuckwagon, rules passed down like scripture. First, never touch the cook's tools. That cast iron skillet might as well be Excalibur. Clean it wrong, and you wish you hadn't been born. Second, don't eat till the cook says so. Sneaking a biscuit early? That's like robbing a church. You'd be blacklisted faster than a horse thief. Third, never badmouth the food. Even if that coffee could strip rust off a wagon wheel, you smiled and said, "Mighty fine, cookie." He'd remember your tone longer than your name. And finally, respect the wagon. It wasn't just his kitchen. It was home, hospital, armory, and sanctuary. Those rules kept order. Because if a man disrespected the cook, it wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. The Chuckwagon was the heart of the trail, and if that heart stopped beating, everyone went hungry. In the wild where law was scarce, respect was the only currency that mattered, and the cook printed it daily. Here's where it gets fascinating. The cook's authority wasn't written down anywhere. He didn't wear a badge, didn't get extra pay. His power came from something older than law. Survival psychology. In the middle of nowhere, food means control. You could be the toughest cowhand in the territory, but if the cook decided you weren't worth feeding, you were done. That created a strange cocktail of fear and respect. Kind of like how we treat the folks who control our Wi-Fi today. You might joke about him, but you don't cross him. Every cowboy depended on that man's goodwill. He wasn't their boss. He was their lifeline. And that dynamic still exists. Every workplace has a cook. The person who quietly runs everything. The one nobody dares to upset because they hold the keys to your comfort. The Cowboys just happened to be honest about it. They showed respect or they starved. Now, some cooks took that power a little too far. There was Beans Murphy, a man so touchy he kept a 6-shooter by the stew pot. Not for rustlers, but for loudmouths. One cowboy joked about his biscuits once. Beans fired a warning shot over his hat. Nobody complained again. Then there was Cookie Dan, poured out an entire pot of coffee because someone called it mud water. The herd nearly mutinied, but still showed up for breakfast the next day. Truth is, most of these men weren't villains. They were exhausted heroes with no glory. They patched wounds, fixed broken bones, shared the last spoonful with homesick greenhorns. But they learned the hard way. Kindness got you ignored. Fear kept order. So they used what worked. A slam lid here, a shouted curse there, just enough thunder to keep the skies calm. Because on the trail, peace didn't come from prayers. It came from a cook who didn't take nonsense. Let's zoom out for a second. The Chuckwagon cook wasn't just a cranky character in a hat. He was the soul of the West, the perfect symbol of its contradictions. The West was a place where survival demanded both cruelty and compassion. You needed a hard hand to stay alive, but a soft one to keep others human. The cook embodied that. He barked, cursed, and threatened. But when night fell, he fed the men like a mother feeds her kids. He was a father figure, a judge, a priest, and a comedian, all hiding behind a beard full of crumbs. In a land that worshipped independence, the cook reminded everyone that no man truly rides alone. The frontier myth loves lone gunslingers, but the truth is, they'd all starve without a man in an apron. He was the beating heart beneath the legend. Gruff, flawed, but utterly indispensable. Cattle drives were barely controlled chaos. Thousands of pounds of beef on hooves, storms that could erase trails overnight, tempers that could spark quicker than dry grass. In that storm of madness, the cook's wagon was the eye, the calm center. No matter what happened, the clang of that iron triangle meant one thing. Life was still running. You could lose cattle, lose friends, even lose your sense of direction. But if the cook was still yelling, the world still made sense. His strictness wasn't tyranny. It was infrastructure. Every slam pot, every scolding, was a little piece of civilization hammered into the wild. That's why the Cowboys feared him. Not because he was mean, but because his discipline was the only thread holding order together. He was the sheriff of the stove, the mayor of beans, the last line of defense anarchy. Out there, fear was the price of survival, and the cook made sure everyone paid on time. Now here's the twist. This isn't just some dusty cowboy tale. It's a mirror. Because even today, our lives still run on Chuckwagon logic. Every company, every family, every team. There's always someone like that cook. The one who organizes the chaos, holds everything together, and scares the hell out of everyone just enough to keep the wheels turning. They're not always loved. They're not supposed to be. Out on the frontier, love didn't feed you. Discipline did. And some truths never age. They just trade campfires for cubicles. So next time you see a Western and laugh at that grumpy old cook, remember, that man was the backbone of the frontier. He didn't just serve beans. He served discipline, structure, and a little taste of home in a place that had none. The Chuckwagon cook wasn't loved because he couldn't afford to be. He was feared. Because deep down, everyone knew the truth. Without him, there was no trail, no drive, no West. He was civilization's first-line cook. And he ran the kitchen like God ran Judgment Day. Now it's your turn. Would you survive under a cook like that, or end up eating dust?